friends, and welcome to Ariel's Twilight Years, how to be a really old model. I'm at home this week, only just. I've been in Canada looking at bears and whales and it was amazing. It was my longest ever holiday away from home with Howell and it was amazing. But now I am back and ready to fully commit to obsessing about my book, which is out on the 24th of August. And I'm very excited. Today, I want to talk about something which I do address in my book. Because although my story is about coming to terms with being kinky, at the same time as telling the story of becoming an internet model. And I've been doing this for 20 years. So I started in 2003. And of course, a lot has changed in that time. So I thought I would start by reading a little extract from my book because I really enjoyed writing about the industry and especially about what it was like 20 years ago because a lot has changed. And then I made myself a little list of the things that have changed particularly dramatically in that 20 years, in my opinion. I would love to hear from other models and photographers who've been doing it for around 20 years or longer, because I'm sure I'll have missed some stuff out and I'm sure you will have things to add that I would love to hear about. So please do comment below and I will read and reply. It's a new industry in some ways, but in other ways, people have been modelling nude for centuries, and it's interesting to see how much has changed in such a short period of history because of the internet, but also, I guess, because of cultural changes. So let's get into it. First of all, Chapter 13, The Kinky World Reveals Itself. My body paint shoot with the artist was at the same studio in Camden that my shoot with the Spanish photographer had been. It was run by two men of around retirement age and had a register of models available to book through the studio. This was pre-internet, the way that models with no agency booked shoots, and the more old-school studios still offered the option. Since I was back for a second shoot in as many weeks, I asked if I could be on their model register. "Of course you can," said the younger and friendlier of the two owners. The other one looked at my chest. I have A-cup breasts. I always have and I always will, barring disaster. But to this traditional glamour studio owner, they were a deal breaker. "I'm afraid not. I don't think you've got the right look." Although used to rejection as an actor, this should have hurt more than it did, given that it was a direct criticism of my physique. But, bolstered by the fact that I now had an entire month of paid work lined up, enough to take me to the end of the year, I took his chest shaming in my stride. And I don't want to sound unduly petty, but over the next 3 years, until the studio eventually closed, I was there almost every week. "I'm back!" I'd sing cheerfully as I passed the owner's office on my way to the dressing room. "I've got another couple of photographers interested. They'd like to book next Tuesday if there's any studio space free. It's the only availability I've got all month." Childishly, I enjoyed flaunting my small-breasted nude model success, and I liked bringing the studio money by way of bookings. I hoped it'd make them think differently about what shape a professional model needed to be. Of course, it was entirely their choice to decide who made it onto their register, but it was nice to show them that there were actually plenty of photographers for whom my physique was no problem. I was never on their register and it didn't matter. The internet modelling world was booming and I had all the bookings I wanted. Now, if anyone suggests that I might want breast implants, and of course people sometimes do because people can be idiots, I think of my 20-year career as a nude model, my beautiful and diverse-looking model friends, the 5 properties that I own as a result of my modelling work, and of the successful creative collaborations in many genres that I've been part of. And I smile, because good teeth are more important than big breasts, in my view, so that's what I had fixed. So this chapter is about 2003, my first month as a model, and writing about it made me really think about what the industry and the culture around art, nude and glamour modelling was back then and how it's changed. So here are some of the things that I identified that I really feel have changed a lot. First of all, the power of studios. So I mentioned it in this chapter. that just before I started modelling, if a studio owner hadn't wanted me to go on his books, I guess I wouldn't have got any work there at all. Clearly, as soon as the internet became popular enough, models started having portfolios online, and so photographers could book them directly. But I guess if I'd started glamour modelling even a couple of years before, I'd have either needed a glamour agent, of which I don't think there were that many, or I would have needed to be on all the studio owners' books, and if some of them turned me down, especially if they were big studios, I guess that would have been a big problem. And over the years that I've been modelling, I've had some really great relationships with studio owners, and I really appreciate them to this day. You know, a lot of them did a lot to promote me when I started modelling, and I think that's probably still the case, that if you are lucky enough to find a friendly, professional studio owner early on in your career, he can introduce you to a lot of photographers and kind of get your career started. But I am glad that these days you could be the sort of model who looked wrong for all of the studios in the country and you could still be successful. Obviously, you still have to appeal to someone. You have to appeal to a critical mass of photographers. But it's nice to know that the power isn't in a small number of, I guess, all male studio owners. I'm glad that the power doesn't rest entirely with them, because this experience that I had, I thought briefly that it was going to stop me being able to succeed, but because internet modelling was booming, as I said, it didn't make any difference at all that the studio didn't want me on their books. I worked there all the time and it was fine. When I started modelling, it was just in the sort of seesaw period where I guess some models still weren't online, so they were getting all their work through either studios or agents, and I've talked to some of those models who either are a bit older than me or just started younger. 5 years later, all the models would have been online, and a lot of the studios didn't have model registers anymore. So I'm glad I saw that, because it is a big change and I got to witness it. Also, I thought about what studios were like back in 2003, and I don't know if there are still really dodgy glamour studios around, or dodgy other types of studios. I do not know, because I don't work in studios as much as I did. But when I look back at the beginning of my career, several people warned me about various studios. I think there was one called Tower Studios somewhere in London, and this is photographers basically told me just don't go there. It's like a kind of cattle market, and I never really knew what happened there. But there were also studios dotted around the country that I worked in. I don't think anyone would probably go to them now, so I guess they're all shut. But they would be often quite small, but they would cram in as many like tiny sets as they possibly could. So there'd be a kind of double bedroom set, just crammed in a corner, and then a metre over there'd be like a barn, and it would be like maybe 1.5 meters wide or 2 meters wide, and then there'd be a Regency living room. And those spaces, I guess especially because I'm tall and big, they were really tricky to work in, because I would tend to expand beyond the scope of one set. So you'd get a bit of Regency and a bit of stable me. And I do remember some of them felt like really seedy places. I mean, some of them still felt lovely. They just weren't particularly kind of stylish, but some of them felt dirty and sleazy and horrible. But at the time, there were also some fantastic studios, just like big white spaces. I remember one called Mirage in Uxbridge that I worked at a lot at the beginning. And there were quite a lot of studios in old mill spaces, as I think there are still now. But I do remember kind of my first year of modelling, when I was going to studios for the first time a lot. It was such a mixed bag. What you got, it could be so surprising. And I do remember once turning up to, it just felt like the only thing that was shot there was really low grade porn. Everything was dirty. It just felt like secretions had happened all over all the surfaces. And I think, let me know below, I don't feel like I've been in a studio like that for a decade plus. I feel like I've been in some dirty studios, but I don't think I've been in any studios where it just felt as though I'd sort of walked into a place where people might be trafficked. I mean, I'm sure there wasn't any of that going on, but I do remember some places that just felt like this doesn't feel like happy people work in this environment. Please let me know, because I am by no means an expert on studios, and I'd love to know other people's take on that. Oh my god. When I started in 2003, there were so few models. I feel like I knew all of their names. It was the same few models coming round and round. There was Peltigera, who was a fantastic, beautiful art nude model. There was Sammy B, she was like a nude and glamour model. There was Becky Speed, who I never actually met. There was someone called Jessie. There was someone called Petra Morgan, who was a gorgeous glamour model. Charlotte G, Rowena, Zoe S, and Rosaline Young. And it just felt like there were about 6 of us. I mean, it was amazing, because if you wanted to check a reference, you just had to ask one of these very small number of models. And obviously the number of models expanded massively in that time. And of course there were other models who I didn't meet. So these must have been the kind of early internet models. There must have been loads and loads and loads of models who were working through agencies or through studio books who I didn't come into contact with. But the kind of early internet models, it just felt like a really small, safe community. And I still cannot believe it when I look now at Purpleport and other modelling network sites. I was the only model in the UK who did nude and worked on point. Can you imagine that? Now, it was such a USP, and now, I mean, we're 2 a penny, and it was really nice to have that kind of rarity value. In fact, the first photographer who booked me to do nude point work, she asked if I could dance on point. She was looking for a ballet dancer who could dance on point. I didn't even have any point shoes anymore because I'd been injured and I'd stopped dancing 7 years before. And she bought me a pair of point shoes, which shows such trust now, because I mean, as far as she knew, I might not have been able to do it anymore. I mean, I didn't know if I could do it anymore, so I turned up to this shoot with these shoes and danced on point again. That just feels like it would never happen now. I don't know what sort of rare skill you'd need for someone to take that risk with you, but it really made getting started so easy, because I didn't even have to invest in a pair of point shoes. I mean, that seems extraordinary now. And what a privilege. And I guess there were fewer photographers, but it didn't feel that way because it felt like everyone had more work than they needed. And again, this might not be true. I might be speaking from privilege, that I was getting plenty of work and the models who I met were getting plenty of work. I just felt like such a fertile time for the industry. And because I suppose we were experiencing this period of growth, more photographers were turning up all the time, more models were beginning to turn up. It felt like being in a snowball. It's tricky to say whether it really was like this or whether it was partly it felt like this because I was new, but it felt like things were growing and improving all the time. Oh, the camera clubs. The first camera club I worked at was in Kennington. It's called the Camera Club. They paid £25 an hour. That's all they paid, and they paid that for years. I don't know when it had been set like that. I think they eventually changed it in 2012 or something. But I lived in London at the time, so it was a quick journey for me. And so £25 an hour at that club didn't seem completely unreasonable. But the camera clubs were an important employer. I think they're probably less so now. I certainly don't work with camera clubs anywhere near as much as I did, and that might be because I've priced myself out of that market, or it might be that there are fewer camera clubs hiring models, but I really enjoyed them. They were exhausting because they all seemed to run kind of group shoot evenings, and I soon discovered that doing group shoots at camera clubs, and to be honest any group shoots to some extent, everyone who has their turn wants you to do everything you already did for the previous photographer and some new stuff. And so as the next photographer takes over their turn, the number of poses you're being asked to repeat is just multiplying and multiplying, and it's so tiring. I guess I probably wouldn't do that type of group shoot now, because it just felt like, what is the point of this? People are getting absolutely identical pictures in identical lighting. What does this mean? In what way is this really creative photography at all? I always say in those kind of situations I just feel like Dame Vera Lynn, entertaining the troops, because it's hard to create anything of much quality in an environment like that. But it of course exposed me to loads of photographers. So I was doing lots of them and I was meeting hundreds of new photographers in a year. So it was very exciting, and some of those went on to be proper serious clients who I worked with one-to-one and did some stuff I was really proud of. I remember once I'd been shooting, this was in Camden, for a group shoot evening, and I went back into the dressing room to change after half an hour of shooting, and I was wearing a maid's outfit with a cap, and it was hanging off the side of my head because the pins had come loose, and I thought, I wonder how long it was like that. No one had said anything. I think they just got shoot blindness and they were just shooting away. So there'll be all these ridiculous, unusable pictures of me somewhere with a hat halfway off my head, hanging over one ear like a big spaniel. Brilliant. Honestly, I don't know. I feel as though there are less of those kind of group shoot nights, camera club nights than there were. But if you are someone who goes to those, and there still are loads, let me know. Because again, this might be that I have just moved away from doing them. It might not be that the industry has changed quite as much as I think in that regard. Okay, so I never experienced this firsthand, but I heard about it enough that I think it's probably true. So there were these kind of cartels of photographers. I think it was Web Model, which was maybe based in the West Midlands. And I think they had a price fix. They'd agreed never to pay a model more than, I want to say £30 an hour, maybe £35 an hour. And so they'd set this ceiling and they wouldn't pay beyond that. I mean, I don't know what happened if you did pay beyond that. Did you get kicked off Web Models? I don't know. But I remember the same thing at the Camera Club in Kennington. There was this ceiling. You couldn't pay above £25 an hour. Now, I eventually realised if I took the booking directly, so the photographer booked me and they booked the studio, rather than it being a studio booking, then I could charge my actual hourly rate, which at the time was £40 an hour. But looking back, I do think the power has probably shifted in that regard, because I feel like I certainly would not work for a reduced rate just because that was the standard rate at the studio. I know I wouldn't. I just turn that stuff down. If people contact me and ask me to come to their studio for studio day and tell me the standard rate is below my rate, I won't do it. And I imagine a lot of models are in the same situation. I kind of hope so, because now that doesn't seem to make sense at all. Why go and work at a reduced rate just because the studio says so? And I suppose the reason it worked back then is because the studios had historically had so much power that they could maybe get you 2 days a week of work, and it made sense to work for a reduced rate rather than try to find the work for yourself when there weren't those many photographers who were hiring independently. But as the number of photographers who are booking their own models has grown, I guess the appeal of having a studio book you at a reduced rate is probably considerably less. But again, I would love to hear from models who are new to the industry. I hope you're not being pressured to do that, but let me know if so. I'd love to hear. I hope that everyone's getting the rate that makes sense to them. But I know at the beginning of my career, I did a whole load of stuff at reduced rates because it felt like the done thing. I think the reason it felt like the done thing was because, at least to some extent, it was the done thing. Oh my God. Okay, so this is alarming. When I started modelling, page 3 girls were not allowed to be 16 anymore. When did that change? Let me just Google this because I don't want to be making it up. Oh my God. So the Sexual Offences Act in 2003, the same year that I started, resulted in the minimum age for women posing on page 3, etc. being raised to 18. So no wonder I experienced this. So by the time I started modelling in November of 2003, you were not allowed to be a topless 16-year-old. But I guess the culture of that still existed. So I remember the first few photographers I worked with in my first couple of weeks as a model. Several of them mentioned this 16-year-old model who was going around to shoot with her mum, and she wasn't shooting topless or nude, to be fair, but they were shooting bikini glamour stuff with her and saying, oh yeah, and like, you know, in 2 years' time she'll be doing topless and nude stuff. Now that just seems really close to grooming. What her mum is taking her around, introducing her to all these photographers who shoot topless nude stuff, letting them shoot her the level below, topless and nude, and basically pre-booking her for when she's 18. And now that I see that the legal change had been so recent, I can see why. Because I'm guessing that was a very, very normal thing, that because everyone was anticipating these very young women becoming the age where they were allowed to do topless or nude work at 16 or 18, depending, it probably didn't seem that strange to have the kind of countdown in the newspapers until a page 3 girl could go topless. But looking back, I was 25 when I started modelling, and hearing these photographers talk about, I mean, it's beautiful, she looked fantastic, like this beautiful 16-year-old gymnast, but sort of saying, oh yeah, she's a fantastic model, here's a picture of her in her underwear, and she's going to come back in 2 years and do nude. I remember thinking, this seems a bit uncomfortable, and it clearly didn't seem so to them, because I guess they'd been in the industry longer, they were older than me, and I guess they'd just seen a lot of that. But I am glad to say that we do have a much more protective attitude to the youngest models now, and I think that's right. I know that my husband, who shoots bondage, tends to not be comfortable booking models unless they are over the age that they could have graduated from university. Not saying that they have to have gone to university, but they have to be kind of 21 plus, just because he feels as though they're in a better position to make an informed decision about what they're doing. And looking back, it feels like getting 16-year-olds to pose for professional and amateur photographers in their lingerie. It doesn't seem like a very responsible or smart thing now. And so I'm glad that as a society, and I think as an industry and community, we've moved away from shooting right to the line of what's acceptable and legal. I think we have more of an attitude of trying to stay away from the line between what's acceptable and what isn't, and I think that has to be a good thing, doesn't it? Oh wow, this is one thing I remember so much from my first year or so as a model. The Schindlering. It's named after Schindler's List, I think. It's the technique where you turn a picture black and white and then you just turn one aspect of the picture into colour. So the model's eyes or the model's lips or a flower that she's holding. And when I look back at the pictures from my first year as a model, oh my God, there's so much of that. Again, is that still around? Does that still exist? I mean, would we laugh at it now, or are there still some people doing that? I want to know. Because it didn't seem funny at the time. To me, it seemed really stylish. I guess because I hadn't seen it much, it seemed really impressive. And like, how are you doing that? It was everywhere. Also, we all had the same clothes, like models. We all shopped in La Senza, basically. There was a lot less choice. So if you're feeling fancy, you might buy lingerie from Ann Summers, but that was quite expensive. La Senza was a bit cheaper, so we all had the same coloured lace boy shorts from La Senza. And it was pre-Primark, so the really cheap clothes weren't available yet, so models' wardrobes were way smaller, way smaller. We had a much smaller selection of items, and so back then photographers and studios often had a lot of clothes because they knew models would turn up with a very limited selection that would probably have been shot by everyone else. Whereas now, unless you're shooting something very specific, you really don't need a big wardrobe as a photographer, because access to cheap clothes means that professional models who are doing it all the time and have a decent budget, we're just going to turn up with, I mean, I've got a room full of clothes and I don't think I'm unusual at all. And that has changed really dramatically. I remember when I went on a modelling shoot in 2007, I went to Primark for the first time and bought a whole load of cheap stuff, and I remember feeling so embarrassed and hoping the other models on the shoot wouldn't realise where I'd gone shopping, because I thought there'd be this sort of shame in it. And I turned up to the shoot and the other models had the same clothes. We'd all gone to Primark. I know there are some ethical issues that now I think we're all becoming more aware of with very cheap fashion, but it was such a revolutionary thing to be able to have lots of cheap clothes instead of a few kind of investment pieces that you take to shoots. And that has been a massive change. When I look back at my modelling pictures from the first couple of years, I was in the same clothes over and over and over again. Oh my goodness. I love this one. When I started modelling, it was totally normal to charge for signing a model release. Sometimes when people get out a really fucking big 5-page one at the end of a shoot, I still wish that we could charge for model releases. Or at a group shoot when everyone gets out a model release. But it was quite standard, I think, to charge your hourly rate on top of however many hours you'd done to sign the release. And there were lots of models, I remember them, on their profiles that said they wouldn't sign a release. Let me know if I'm wrong, but I've not seen that on a model's profile for, it feels like 2 decades, but I think, again, that was just beginning to change. So I don't think I ever did charge for a model release. I remember noticing that lots of people did and wondering if I should, but because I'd been poor and modelling rates seemed so high to me, I felt inappropriate, felt greedy to ask for any more, so I didn't, and very soon that became the norm. So I think I was just seeing the cultural shift. And looking back, I suppose it's because pre-digital, pre-internet, you could model nude and have some expectation that if you didn't sign a model release, no one would ever see those pictures. Whereas as soon as the internet started to really grow, it doesn't matter whether you sign a release or not. Good luck policing where your pictures go. So I suppose that's one of the reasons it's changed. But it is really interesting looking back at how big those changes have been and how fast they've been. And I wish I'd been modelling longer. You know, if I'd been modelling 30 years, I would have seen the complete pre-internet modelling world as well. And what did that look like? And what will it look like in 10 more years? So normally, I know I'm very keen on sharing my opinions. But this time, I'm aware that I only know part of the story and I've only got really one person's perspective, which has been enriched a little by talking to other models over the years. But I would love to know from anyone who's been doing it longer than me, please let me know what you've experienced, and I'd love to hear people's predictions for what's going to change in the future. So please comment below, like, subscribe. I will be back with more modelling and book related stuff in the near future. I'm just going to leave you with, this book was made for me by my dear friend Guy Windsor. Thank you so much. I keep it for just book stuff. Here are the reviews I've got from authors. I'm not going to say which authors they are yet because you will find out in time, but here are my 3 short reviews. Moving and heartfelt, an utterly brilliant whirlwind of a book. I like that one very much. An erudite and witty insight into the world of BDSM modelling, but more than that, it is a deeply felt exploration of freedom, what it takes to be free and what it looks like. And often hilarious, frequently moving, sometimes disturbing and even harrowing, above all, fearlessly honest. These are pre-publication reviews for my book, my memoir, Playing to Lose, all about growing up as Jehovah's Witness, becoming an internet model and discovering my heart's desire, which is doing BDSM through modelling. It is being published in August. Pre-orders are open and every order helps. As it is, my publishers seem quite excited about publicising it, and so they are putting effort into doing that, but the more pre-sales I have, the more confidence they have that I am worth investing time and effort into. Thank you as always for watching, and it's bye-bye from me now. Bye-bye! Bye-bye now. Bye-bye!